I kept the napkin in my top drawer like a talisman. The corner still stained with Darius's coffee where he'd sketched the 4 chords that would become the song people in Marfa swore could quiet the wind. He wrote it the night the sky cracked open and the strange lights were dancing above the flats. And he said the melody arrived in him the way a river finds a bend, inevitable, simple, true. And he put my name in the margin as if naming a star. And I believed him because belief was the kind of currency you have to use when you marry a man who lives half his life inside sound. That napkin's papery whisper would greet me whenever I reached for tape or paperclips in my classroom, and I'd touch it the way some people cross themselves. A small gesture to anchor a day. In Marfa, stories are the air, and sound travels a long way over empty land. Gossip rolls across the prairie like tumbleweed and gathers barbed edges. But it had been kind to us at first. To the quiet art teacher who once thought in colors and to the musician with the once broken, forever beautiful voice, and it felt like we had a home stitched together from late nights at the bar with sagging string lights. Mornings at the school where I taught sophomores to see a line as a kind of promise. And weekend drives past the ghostly Prada store that fooled tourists into thinking money could haunt too. Our rituals were small and specific. And the song, our song, was the truest ritual of all. He would play it on Wednesdays when the regulars were sober enough to listen and tipsy enough to tip, and he would find me in the dim and sing the bridge the way you cup water in your hands, careful not to spill. He told me the bridge came from the first time he saw me setting up a still life of bleached bones and dusty sunflowers in the classroom. How I stood back and waited for shadows to settle into place, and that detail felt like proof. Like a cord tied around a memory only we could tug. So when people called it ours, I didn't argue. I tucked myself deeper into that word like a bird into cedar when the north wind starts its teeth-chattering work. I met Marigold on a Sunday after church let out early because the radiator in the sanctuary had died and the pastor's breath was fogging the pulpit. She came back into town wearing a coat that made her look like an exclamation mark against the chalky winter sky, and when she said my name it felt like a book opening to a chapter I didn't remember writing, because we'd been girls who shared glue sticks and secrets, and then overnight, she'd left after graduation with the kind of velocity that suggests you're being chased by your own longing. She had letters postmarked from cities that sounded invented and then no letters at all, and now she stood on the sidewalk by the bakery where the owner burned the cinnamon rolls every other Tuesday and told me she was back for a while to let the dust decide if it wants me, and I laughed because that is how you talk here. Like the land has opinions. She hugged me. And something inside the hug was sharper than it needed to be. A pin left in a dress by a hurried seamstress. And then she pulled back and said she had to find a place for a celebration because she was turning 29 the following week and wanted noise, not candles, and I said, as any friend would say whether the friendship had been sleeping or dead, that we would make it happen. I said Darius would sing if she wanted. Because music is the cheapest gift that sounds expensive. And she smiled in a way that suggested she'd already considered this and was waiting for me to offer it so she could pretend to be surprised. If I trace it back, if I do the forensic work of the heart, I can find other small crimes I committed against myself. The time I waved off a coldness in Darius's eyes as fatigue from the late set. The handful of nights he came home smelling like someone else's hand lotion, and I told myself it was the bar's new bartender switching brands. The text he sent that said just there at 11:03 p.m. A word that needs a preposition to make proper sense. And I didn't ask what street or what door because good wives in small towns don't make scenes that will turn into parables on the grocery store aisles. I kept consolidating my doubts like loose change in an old jar, waiting for a future errand that would require exact coins. My students were working on self-portraits that week. Not the kind with mirrors but the kind built from objects, ticket stubs, thrifted brooches, grocery lists in their mother's hard-angled handwriting, and it made the classroom smell like old paper and metal, and behind all of it I kept hearing the chorus of our song in the back of my skull like an engine idling, and it soothed me the way it always had, reminding me that I had evidence of chosenness. Darius had etched my name into something that lived outside of both of us. And in a desert even a melody feels like a house. Marigold came by the school to finalize details. She wanted the birthday at the bar. She wanted cake with handwriting so ornate it would look like a threat. She wanted everyone to remember something the next day even if it was a headache, and as we walked the empty hallway she noticed the napkin pinned above my desk and said, "You kept it," in a tone that made it sound like a person, and before I could ask which it she meant, she was already telling me how she'd missed my paintings of sky and scrub brush. How in other places the sky is a ceiling but here it's a rumor that refuses to end. She was saying everything right, which is a talent some people develop while moving through cities where learning to open doors with sound is as important as having keys. The night of her birthday arrived in a gust of wind that rattled the corrugated roof and made the street look like it was wearing static. The bar filled the way a glass fills, tilt, pour. Pause, breathe, and Darius tuned his guitar while nodding at men who swallowed his greeting like aspirin, and I took my usual place at the corner table where the wood has a burn mark shaped like a coin, and Marigold was everywhere at once, hugging people, tilting her head for photographs, inventorying love the way some women inventory harm. And when she reached me she set her hands on my shoulders as if trying to read Braille there, and whispered, "Thank you for this." And her breath smelled like grapefruit and something darker I couldn't place. The first set went like it always did. Darius warmed the room with a cover of a song that belongs to campfires and fathers. Then a bluesy thing about trains that never stop here but still haunt the tracks. And between songs he spoke in the low comic way that tells a crowd you're not here to make them feel stupid for feeling. I watched his mouth shape vowels of kissed, and a feeling like pride rose up in me, stubborn and bright and maybe lazy. Because pride doesn't require you to verify anything. It just invites you to stand in your own warmth and clap when the lights flickered twice. A signal to the bartender that the cake should start sweating under its candles. Marigold climbed onto a stool in her red dress and clanged a spoon against a glass, and everyone made the sound a small town makes when it agrees to something, and I thought, here comes the toast, here comes the part where Darius plays the upbeat one he wrote for a girl's quinceañera last summer. Here comes the normal shape of a night. Instead, Darius reached for the second guitar, the beat-up one with my name carved light into the back where only I would feel it when he handed it to me, and he looked out at the room and then directly, unmistakably, at Marigold in her stubborn red and said, "This is for the birthday girl." And before my brain could assemble the panic into a sentence, his fingers found the first chord of our song and the sound came like a match. Small and absolute, and in the beat before the words he closed his eyes and smiled the gratitude smile he reserved for me when he hit the bridge just right. And then he sang the opening line, the one that mentions the bones and the dusty flowers. And he sang it not as a recollection but as an address. As if the song had merely been sleeping in our house this whole time and had woken hungry in someone else's. The room tilted, spoons in coffee cups clinked like tiny hammers. Marigold's face went still in the way a pond goes still when a hawk passes. And everything I had balanced on the napkin's promise slid at once. Not with the violence of a crash but with the serenity of an object finally obeying gravity. The room applauded like it had been rehearsed, palms slapping the air, glasses raised. Marigold's laugh flaring brighter than the string lights. And I sat motionless with my throat locked, trying to decide whether to swallow or scream. The chords rolled out as if nothing had fractured. As if I wasn't sitting there with the napkin burning a hole through my purse. As if the song had never belonged to me at all. Darius's voice dipped low on the second verse. The part about waiting on the porch while the horizon paints itself in rust. And he tilted his head toward Marigold with a softness I thought was mine. A softness that I had once mistaken for devotion, and in that tilt I saw the years I'd lost. The canvases I'd never painted because I was too busy being a wife whose worth was measured in harmonies. Someone brushed past my table, setting down a slice of cake slick with icing that shimmered like wet paint. And I stared at the sugar roses because they were safer than watching my husband serenade a ghost from my childhood. The cake smelled like almond, the cheap extract kind. And it carried me back to a night when Marigold and I were 16. When we baked box cake in her mother's kitchen and talked about escape routes, hers to anywhere. With lights, mine to any place Darius would eventually carry me, and I wondered, with a sickness crawling up my spine, if the song had already been written then. If she had already been chosen before I ever learned to kiss him under the bleachers. The applause died and chatter filled the cracks, and Darius leaned close to Marigold, whispering something that pulled a smile out of her, slow and deliberate. The way a magician produces a coin. I wanted to rise, to cross the room and demand an answer. But I felt nailed into the chair by the eyes of the town. In Marfa, secrets don't stay secrets. They become folklore by morning. And I knew if I moved wrong tonight my name would change shape on every tongue by dawn. So I stayed seated, my hands damp against my skirt. And let the humiliation spread like dye in water. When the set ended, Darius climbed off stage, the guitar cradled like a child. And before he reached me, Marigold intercepted him, hand on his arm. Her nails painted a shade too close to blood. They spoke in tones meant for two but shaped for me. Every pause stretching thin across the room until it snapped inside my head. Finally he reached me, his smile rehearsed, his kiss a brush against my hairline. Not lips to lips, and he said, "Long night, huh?" As though nothing had shifted, as though my world wasn't a table flipped in silence. I muttered something, maybe good set words that tasted like tin, and he moved on, busying himself with cables and empty glasses. Outside the bar, the desert wind whipped sharp enough to slice. And I stepped into it just to remember what unfiltered air felt like. Marigold followed, her heels crunching gravel. And when I turned she was close enough that I could see the faint scar across her eyebrow. A relic from when we tried to climb the school roof and she fell but laughed all the way down. She looked at me the way she used to look at test answers she already knew, patient, superior. Inevitable. It was always mine, she said softly, not as confession but as reminder. As though she was doing me a kindness by restoring history to its rightful order. My mouth opened but nothing came, because all I had were memories of Darius calling it ours. Memories that suddenly felt forged. And the realization that my whole marriage might have been built on recycled vows. Marigold's perfume caught the wind, jasmine and smoke, and for a moment it felt like the town itself inhaled, waiting to see if I would fight or fold. I walked home with the sound of his guitar still clinging to my skin like static. Every chord replaying not as music but as evidence. And when I unlocked our front door, the house greeted me with its usual silence. The kind that once felt peaceful but now throbbed with accusation. I set my purse on the counter and pulled out the napkin. The fragile square that had once been sacred. And I smoothed it flat as if by pressing it hard enough I could iron the truth back into the paper. The ink looked faded, the letters of my name ghostly. And I imagined Marigold's name penciled there first, erased, replaced. Rewritten until history itself became a palimpsest. I wondered how many times I had lived inside borrowed words without noticing the seams. Darius came home an hour later, humming, not the whole melody but fragments. As if the song were leaking out of him without permission. And he kissed my temple with lips chilled from the wind. I wanted to shove the napkin against his chest and demand an accounting, but instead I said, "Did you have fun?" And he nodded like a boy proud of a drawing pinned to the fridge. He poured himself a glass of water, his shoulders loose. His face flushed with the kind of satisfaction that follows applause. And then he asked if I thought Marigold liked her song. Her song. The two words hit harder than anything he might have confessed outright. And I realized he wasn't even trying to conceal it. In his mind the truth was harmless. Natural, as obvious as the desert sky. I asked, my voice steadier than I felt, "When did you write it?" He frowned, surprised, as though I'd asked what year the sun was born. "Long before you and I met," he said, "back when Marigold was still around." "It was hers first, Elowen. I thought you knew." My knees nearly buckled but I gripped the counter. Staring at the reflection of the ceiling fan in the glass of water. The blades spinning without moving air. Every memory I had of him dedicating that song to me cracked open like eggshells. Spilling yolk that smelled of betrayal. He kept talking about how songs find their own owners. How music can belong to more than one person. How love and melody overlap like colors in a painting. But I wasn't listening, I was counting the years I had spent wearing another woman's crown. The years I had believed myself chosen when really I was second draft. That night I didn't sleep, I lay awake beside him while he dreamed soundlessly. And I stared at the ceiling until the lines in the plaster formed maps of roads I had never taken, and for the first time since I'd followed him into marriage I wondered if it was possible to leave without erasing myself completely. The desert outside was restless, coyotes howling in a chorus that sounded almost like laughter. And I felt as though the whole town had always known what I was only now learning. That the song was never mine, that perhaps Darius himself was never mine. That maybe even my memories belonged to someone else. ChatGPT said. Morning arrived without mercy, sunlight pouring through the thin curtains as if determined to expose every thought I had tried to bury in the night. And I rose from the bed careful not to wake Darius. Though the truth was he could have slept through a storm, I dressed in silence. Each movement deliberate, and carried the napkin in my pocket like a wound I refused to bandage. At school, my students filed in with the distracted chatter of teenagers. But their eyes sharpened when they saw me pin the napkin above the board. A strange relic pinned like a butterfly. I told them it was an example of how even fragile scraps can hold power. And I watched them lean in, their pencils pausing. as if they could sense I was speaking less about art and more about survival. At lunch, Marigold appeared at the door of my classroom, her smile rehearsed, her voice too bright, and she asked if I wanted to walk with her to the diner where the fries were always soggy but the gossip was crisp. I wanted to say no, but something in her expression, half challenge, half invitation, made me nod. And soon we were seated in the vinyl booth where the seams had split and stuffing peeked out. Like in Spoken Truths. She ordered cherry pie and coffee, I ordered nothing. And she leaned across the table as if the distance between us had always been temporary. You should have known, she said, words sliding out like knives wrapped in velvet. That song was ours before it was yours. Darius and I, we had our time. I clenched my hands in my lap, nails cutting crescents into skin, and forced myself to meet her eyes. They were steady, almost pitying. The way you look at someone who wandered into the wrong story. Why come back now? I asked, my voice low. She shrugged, spearing a cherry with her fork, red syrup staining her lips. Because unfinished things call you home. And because he still sings it for me. Her certainty pressed against me like a tide, and I felt the edges of myself eroding. Piece by piece. That night, I confronted Darius with her words. But instead of denial or apology, he looked at me with something closer to exhaustion. As though the weight of two women's claims on one melody had finally crushed him. Songs aren't prisons, Elowen, he said, sitting with his guitar across his knees, plucking at strings that refused to stay in tune. They drift. They attach themselves where they're needed. Maybe I was wrong to let you believe it was only yours, but can't you see it doesn't matter? What matters is now. But I couldn't see, now, without the shadow of before. I couldn't lie beside him without hearing the echo of Marigold's laughter in the margins. I stood by the window, watching the desert swallow the last light, and realized I was living in a house built on borrowed music. A house that would collapse if I breathed too hard. The song had been a promise, and now it was proof that what I thought was ours had always been a rehearsal for someone else's return. The days after that conversation stretched long and brittle, like wires pulled too tight across empty land. And every moment hummed with a tension I couldn't silence. At school I caught myself staring at the napkin on the board until the lines blurred. And when students asked if they could start new projects I nodded absently, hearing only the ghost of the melody looping in my skull. The town felt complicit too. Marfa has a way of amplifying whispers until they rattle through windows, and I noticed glances lingering on me in the grocery store, in the post office. As though everyone was waiting for me to either crumble or ignite. Marigold, of course, seemed to bloom under the attention. She was everywhere. Her red dress aflare against the pale desert, her laughter spilling out of the bar. Her hand brushing Darius's arm too easily when he carried his guitar past her. And no one stopped her because small towns love spectacle more than they love loyalty. I began cataloging her moves, the way one might track a storm. When she lingered outside the bakery, when she left her car idling by the school, when she slipped into the pew 2 rows ahead of me at church and bowed her head with saintly precision. It was an obsession I hated myself for. But it gave me something solid to hold onto while everything else dissolved. One evening, when the sky bruised purple and the coyotes started their rough hymns, I found Darius on the porch, strumming without purpose. The kind of absent playing that means a man's mind is elsewhere. I asked him, finally, the question that had been corroding me: if she hadn't left, would it have been me? Or was I always the replacement? He didn't answer immediately, and that silence was the loudest truth I'd ever heard. He set the guitar down gently, as though afraid to startle it, and said, "You were what I needed then. She was what I needed before. Maybe I don't know what I need now." His honesty landed like a blow, not because it was cruel but because it was naked. Stripped of pretense. I wanted to scream, to shatter the quiet with rage. But instead I laughed, sharp and brittle. Because the absurdity of sharing a life with someone who couldn't even anchor his own heart was too much to bear. That night I packed a small bag. Not to leave but to test the weight of the decision. And I placed it by the door where it sat like a dare. Darius didn't ask about it. Marigold didn't need to. And I, for the first time, began to imagine a version of myself not defined by someone else's song, but by the silence I would choose for myself. The bag by the door became a silent companion, its presence both threat and promise. And each morning I brushed past it on my way to class, wondering if today would be the day I lifted it and walked out for good. My students noticed the shadow under my eyes. And one of them, a girl named Juniper with a sketchbook always pressed to her chest, asked if I was okay, her voice trembling with the kind of honesty only teenagers still carry, and I lied. Because what else could I do, telling her I was just tired? Though tired doesn't explain the way your chest feels hollow when you wake beside someone whose dreams are no longer tethered to yours. Meanwhile, Marigold's orbit around Darius tightened. She began showing up at his sets as if she were an inevitable note in every song. Her smile stitched across the air until even strangers began to assume she belonged there. And when someone at the bar joked that she was his muse, I watched him neither deny nor confirm, just letting the word hang there like smoke. One afternoon, while cleaning my classroom, I heard her heels in the hallway before I saw her. And when she appeared in the doorway, she wasn't smiling, she was holding her hands over her stomach, a subtle gesture but heavy enough to stop my breath. "I thought you should hear it from me," she said, and the words came steady, rehearsed. Devastating. She was pregnant. The syllables rearranged the architecture of my world in an instant, demolishing the flimsy scaffolding of hope I had been balancing on. My fingers went numb around the paintbrush I was washing, blue water spilling over the sink like a wound. And for a moment the room tilted as if gravity itself had betrayed me. She didn't gloat, she didn't soften. She just delivered the fact like a letter slid under a locked door, and then she was gone, leaving only the echo of her heels and the smell of her perfume. That night I confronted Darius, shaking, clutching the napkin in my fist until it tore, demanding to know if it was true. And he didn't answer right away, he only sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders sagging as though the confession had already been made somewhere else. And finally he whispered, "I don't know what to do." The cruelty of it wasn't in the betrayal itself but in his uncertainty. His inability to choose even in the wreckage. And I realized then that I had been waiting for a man who didn't exist. A man who could be faithful, decisive, mine. The bag by the door was still there, patient, ready. And for the first time I thought I might actually lift it. I touched the handle of the bag that night as if it were a live wire. And in that moment I understood leaving wasn't about where I would go but about reclaiming the pieces of myself I had given away one chord at a time. Darius sat slumped in the chair, his guitar silent for once, his face pale with a fear he couldn't name. And I almost pitied him, almost reached out. But then I remembered Marigold's steady voice in my classroom and the certainty in her eyes. and pity evaporated into something harder. I walked through the house touching objects as though to test their loyalty, the cracked mug with paintbrushes in it, the photograph of my students on field trip day. The napkin now torn and useless, and I realized none of them belonged to him, not really. They belonged to me, to the life I had built in spite of him. At dawn, the desert sky was streaked with pink. The kind of color that makes promises without words, and I lifted the bag. Surprised at how light it felt, as if all the years of waiting had already been shed. Darius stirred then, eyes opening heavy and lost. And he whispered my name with the voice of a man watching water slip through his fingers. But I didn't answer. I stepped outside, the air sharp and clean. Coyotes still singing in the distance. And for the first time in years I felt like the song inside me was mine alone. Wordless but unbreakable. As I walked down the dirt road, the town still asleep, I thought of my students' self-portraits made from scraps and ticket stubs. And I understood that I too was a collage. Stitched together not by a man's melody but by my own resilience. Maybe Marigold would have her song, maybe she would even have his child. But what she could never steal was the lesson, that borrowed love is never shelter. And that silence, when chosen, can be the loudest and truest music of all.